So good morning, all. Thank you for that marvelous sharing last night. When I was driving in with Eric this morning from the monastery, we were having a conversation about, training he's been receiving with the Tibetan Buddhists in Bhutan. And the conversation came up about, well, how does one actually make contact with a realized master that will come up? How does one hold the thread across the realms? And the first piece of the teaching is about devotion. So I was interested. We'll probably cycle back to this later on in the conversation, but I just mentioned in passing that when we started talking and finding our way last night, what soon seemed to percolate into the room as the basis from which we were working was devotion. That the people who had come came out finally of devotion to Thomas and of a really deep love that said, we can't not be here. And when the speaking sort of settled into where people were speaking from, it was so deeply from the heart. And so deeply from that sense of gratitude and devotion. I noticed that at the time last night, but didn't know what to make of it until Eric just made that comment as we drove in the morning, that we became a little field of devotion. So, and that feels almost like a sacred vocation in its own place. And so we'll see where that goes today. We have some work to do this morning in that we're going to take a pass through hopefully all three of what will be the panel discussions, the panel topics. And part of that work is to listen into them deeply ourselves. In the spirit, of course, of the Snowmass Conference, in the spirit of that model that Thomas so beautifully modeled to us, of letting the collective oneness of our silence and the collective oneness of our yearning allow us to speak from our hearts about real things and to listen from our hearts equally within the circle. So we'll be doing that first, and just to listen and see what kind of collective knowledge and wisdom abides in this group of people. And the second is to pay a little attention of how it's going to shape itself into what transpires in the public part of the program that will begin at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And again, remembering that this is not something that we as the entertainers are doing for the public. There is no dividing. We're, if anything, yeast, leaven in the lump, and that we want to simply use this time and this work together to put together a container that these other people who are equally wise and equally devoted to Thomas and equally full of truth, to put it together so that if we do our work well, 250 people can also become a contemplative listening body. And the idea is that we're going to wind up in some way or another with a moderator and probably 3 panelists per question taken from among this group, who will simply start the ball rolling. And what we would think if you wind up in those seats, and we have no idea who any of those people are going to be at this point, that each of the ones in the panelists might think in terms of preparing maybe 5 to 10 minutes of something you would say on the subject, and then conversation with each other across that way. Again, it's a model that I've seen in many. The Festivals of Faiths uses that model really well. And then widening that conversation to include people from the audience who will join in and be acknowledged. So when we look for and keep an eye on who are the combinations, who are going to be the panelists, and who's going to be the moderator of the panelists, we're going to be looking for where the interest lies, what the juice is, who are the people that sort of really speak to each other well together, who have some really significant input, and who can hold the space in a way that it's really transparent and opening and inviting for the others to join in. And I think that a lot of that is going to come by consensus and obviosity. It goes to say that the moderator, as we pick them out, should not ideally be the one who has an impassioned agenda to show forth, because the moderator's role is to really keep the conversation on track and to call forth the impassioned agendas for others. So we'll see where you gravitate. We'll see what your input is. And what I want to do this morning, this is, of course, free sharing around the circle. I'm going to ask some questions to get the topics going. I may even take some notes as they go. I may cut in to see if people can clarify things a little bit. And we'll see where we wind up with it. It's 9 now. I would like very much for this session to be done by 9:45 so that we can take another 15-minute break and get on to the next topic, if that doesn't feel too militaristic. So that sound like a game plan that works? Okay. And the other thing has been said already, but I'll say it again. When you speak, we'll pass the mic to you. Who are the mic holders? Okay, so that we can record this for posterity, for what good that does, but it'll do some good. So the first topic up to bat is the topic of oneness. And in general, the big question we're going to hover around, from your own personal experience, from the time you traveled with Thomas, what is Thomas's vision or understanding of oneness? And as we kind of jumped into it last night, we've talked about how there's 3 threads, or actually 4 threads here. Oneness is a state of consciousness that many of us would call no separation or non-duality. Oneness as the intrinsic, essential nature and destiny of the world's religions. Their real common ground. Oneness as the future of the world. Oneness as a future towards which humankind needs to be marching if we are to move along with the evolutionary current and to escape. I mean, Thomas said at one side that the most powerful sin for the planet was humanicide. And I think finally one that to my knowledge, Thomas didn't dip into deeply, but would be very interesting to see what wisdom the group has on this. Oneness with all sentient beings. Oneness with nature. Oneness not just with the human intellectual sphere, but with the rocks and and the trees, the leaves, and the ecology of our planet. Where was his sensitivity on that? So we're just going to have a conversation about what he understood of oneness. Some sort of sub-questions, which I may cut in on and pick your brains on, or if you feel like you have something. Do you see any changes or developments in his understanding of oneness over the time you knew him? Was he growing in his understanding? And if so, how? Another thing I'm interested in is, are there any what you might call uniquely Christian, or at least uniquely Western, aspects to his understanding of oneness? Is it different from like a Buddhist understanding or a Hindu understanding? And if so, how? And another, implicit in that is, do you think Thomas, particularly in his final days, did he leave Christianity behind? Did he become post-Christian? Was it a transcend and include kind of deal? How did he remain anchored in the tradition of his birth, or did he? And I think all of these questions are interesting, significant. So I invite any one of you to just jump in anywhere you want with any of that, and also to just keep track, and if something looks like it's badly unintended toward the end, I'll come back and yell at you for that a little bit, okay? So over to you.
I was thinking of a couple things on this question with Thomas. And one was, I don't know, I had this, the way it was phrased, it just made me kind of think about something different, kind of the ascent to unity consciousness. And so I just thought, the way I experienced Thomas in the last few years was very much, he would always talk about becoming nothing, which I think is obviously related to unity consciousness, but it had a different tone, a different way of, it wasn't like coming into this like expansive thing or this sort of beautiful beatitude. To me, it came across as very, well, Felina mentioned this, very difficult. A lot of suffering, I think, in his body and not being able to have interaction with others as much as he wanted. And really about just becoming nothing, this real humbleness seemed to be what he always talked about with me. And it connoted a very different kind of feeling than this idea of really coming into an enlightened state.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I thought I would share that.
Just real quickly to add to that, this notion of suffering really seemed to come to the surface in the process of oneness.
Oh, and the Christian thing, I just thought of that for a second too. Thomas's idea that there was like a plan unfolding, that there's something in that oneness that's operating in a kind of movement of the world, I think was a Christian element that's not always easy to discern in some of the Eastern traditions. And I actually felt like he became more Christian as he got towards the end.
In what respect? Could you say, Rory?
At a certain point, I felt like he was really moving out and saying a lot. And then in the last, especially the last years of the Snowmass Conference, he really started to put everything in kind of fundamental Christian theological terms that made a lot of sense. And I had some conversations with him. I don't quite want to share everything, but it did feel like he really came very much home in his Christian roots and felt that as not just his deep grounding, but the deep revelation he was really working with and saw is very fundamental to his path.
What I was going to say is actually on both elements of what Rory said, taking off on that. To me, Thomas's sense of oneness came from that sense of emptying the self, minimizing the self. And that was true of his embrace of religions also. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that when the plant is young, you have to hedge around it in order to keep, of course, using the Indian analogy, cows and goats from eating the young plant. You have to protect it. But after the plant becomes big, you take down the barriers, and you can even tie an elephant to the tree then. It doesn't need the protections. And so that's what I saw in Tom. The removal of barriers. It wasn't that he left Christianity in any sense. And also come back in just a moment to affirm what Rory just ended with. It wasn't that he left Christianity, it's that he didn't need barriers anymore. He felt free to be free from walls and to expand, not from one thing to and go from one thing to another, but to expand into other fields of thinking, of being, etc. So that becoming nothing was fundamental to me, to his sense of oneness. And then on his the Christian element, I remember something I'll always remember from Tom. It was once in a snowmass meeting. He said, he prefaced his remarks by saying, well, now, I don't know if this is good Catholic doctrine. I don't even know if it's Catholic doctrine at all. But now, my experience is, and he would express it, and it was about the no self, very beautifully expressed. But then when the last snowmass meetings that I went to, again, I found that he felt comfortable expressing that same thing through Christian imagery. He would, something that for years I'd not heard him do much in the snowmass meetings, he began to speak about the Trinity. And he would express what it was that he was experiencing through the imagery of the Trinity. And so in that I saw first the expansion by removing the walls. He didn't feel the need of the walls. In fact, at that same time when he was saying that, I don't know if this is good Catholic doctrine or Catholic doctrine at all, he was talking about how painful it was to him to go to Mass. He found it extremely painful to go to Mass because he couldn't put his mind in the forms anymore, and he wanted to be free of those forms. But later again, he felt free to express himself through those forms because he no longer felt restricted, because he had grown beyond them.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of my relationship with Thomas was building the message outward, particularly because of what we do at the UN. And there was always the assumption of unity consciousness or non-duality under it, but there was the understanding that this was a confluence that was growing globally, inevitably. And the reason I mention it is that, was with Ken Wilber 2 days ago, and then Raleigh shortly after we were there. And Ken is very much the same way, the assumption that something is unfolding where humanity is going to figure out wholeness, it's going to figure out the implications of profound interconnection, and that irrespective of the developmental level of any particular person, let's say like Thomas, who was so anchored in what Wilber would call quadrant one. But then you look at the scientific community and a guy like David Sloan Wilson, who's now, luckily for us, the most famous evolutionary biologist in the world, they say. And he's exactly in this same place, the assumption that Homo sapiens is moving toward this sense of wholeness and this sense of oneness, and yet he claims to be an atheist. But he sees it in the data sets of the new models of evolution, that this is the only way that we will inevitably achieve this global civilization that's based on the heart, and then the heart as expressed most profoundly through the great wisdom tradition. So he can say that, even saying at the same time that he's an atheist, where I actually think he's a nature mystic. But anyway, I just find fascinating even the assumptions in the United Nations community now. If you sit down in a meeting of the Council of NGOs, anybody who's anchored in any tradition that, let's say, is humanist or do-gooderish or in any of the great wisdom traditions, they're exactly in this place. It's uncanny. And that wasn't true 3 to 5 years ago. So it's interesting, Eric and I were talking this morning that's how we had met. We'd corresponded but never met personally, in arranging particularly Zooms that Thomas was doing with others that he couldn't meet personally. And so this amazing assumption, which I think is just truth, this is what Ken Wilber was saying, it's just truth, that we're evolving toward this self-evident sense of oneness, and the implications of it are the world that we'd like to see that's based on the heart. So just to throw in that tangent.
as far as the development goes for Thomas, last night I talked a little bit about when I met with him, and he said, I asked him about the self, and he said, it's just a sliver, like a fingernail, or the moon. And then, of course, the next day he didn't remember saying that and said that it didn't sound like him at all. But then some years later, we were talking, and he told me about, I think it's in one of the books too, the abyss. And he took me on a little journey. It's like it's as if you're falling in an abyss, and no one can help you. God doesn't help you. The Virgin Mary doesn't help you. No one seems like they're helping you.
Sounds like somebody turned off that mic.
But you crash on the bottom of bottomlessness into a zillion pieces, and each piece is born as God.
Wow.
And that, to me, was Thomas's oneness. And it was just, I was blown away. So, at least in my experience of Thomas, he definitely went through. He was definitely at the fingernail, and then he definitely was smashed.
Justin, just point of clarification. When did that conversation about you get smashed into a zillion pieces and each piece is God, do you have any idea when and where that took place?
That conversation was in, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, 2
Okay.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the little reading room.
Okay, so you would have been visiting him in Snowmass when that happened.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
And I don't think I was the first one that he told that story to, because I
Yeah.
think it's in one of the books,
Yeah.
with later books.
Okay, great.
I didn't know Thomas the way that so many of you did. I just met him for the first time with our Young Contemplatives gathering, but the only thing I want to offer in this conversation is kind of back to the suffering that Felina brought up. There seemed to be this profound bodiliness to Thomas's great love and oneness, and I want to bring that into this conversation as a point of wholeness and almost like a realization of incarnational mysticism that seemed to be very physical. It was not up here, it was not out here, it was right here and right here. And because of that, I think there was a level of oneness that he was able to bring us into in the room, because he was so deeply physical. And I don't know how else to say that, except to say it was profoundly incarnate, that experience and that encounter. It was very bodily.
When we talk about oneness, it has many different flavors. And depending on the tradition within which you use the word oneness, it has different flavors. And one flavor that emerged for me was in one of the Snowmass conferences when we were doing a meditation, sitting around the circle. And then afterwards, we were having a discussion about the meditation. And I described within a Buddhist context that if and when you get to a point where you feel like you are actually unifying with the divine, the deity, and you might feel some bliss consciousness that emerges, then one becomes attached to the bliss, and it takes you away from the oneness, or from that relationship. And so in the Buddhist context, we use the term emptiness, which is to say, as that begins to emerge, we empty it out, and we realize that it, in and of itself, is interdependent, that is empty of inherent existence. So you don't become attached to it and get carried away from it. As I said that, right after I said that, George Timko, who was an Eastern Orthodox priest, said, "Oh, Ed, that sounds like our Hesychast tradition within the Eastern Church." And he said, when we get to that point, we meditate no thingness. So there is this kind of radical, I think Cynthia used the word kenosis a lot. There's this self-emptying, and Thomas would also, I think, talk about it as emptying oneself as of the false self. At which point, maybe you can experience a unity consciousness, but to the extent that you become attached to that, then you're repelling it. So at that point, I'm just thinking here, looking at the title of the book, Reflections on the Unknowable, that at that point you are, in a sense, removed from the conceptualization of it, or should be, because we want to reify it, we want to confine it to our concepts, and then whatever that oneness is, which is ineffable, that unity consciousness is, which is ineffable, we repel it. So there's that balance between the via negativa, right, and the emptying of the self, the becoming of that, without reifying it, without grasping onto it. So I found that a compatible, he and I used to talk about this quite a bit, that seemed to be quite compatible with him.
If nobody else is eager to jump in, oh, okay, good. Kabir, go for it, yeah.
So I wonder if, in talking about oneness, we think that humanity is moving towards a non-differentiated state of spiritual oneness where we all recognize similar values and a similar reality. I don't know if that will ever happen, but it might. Let's see. But I'm wanting to quote something from Rumi because he's often quoted to affirm a kind of non-differentiated spirituality. Rumi says, "From now till the day of judgment, there will never be oneness in this world." That's the nature of this existence. And we can give thanks for that, I think. But is there an underlying oneness? Is there something unifying these differences and this diversity? Is there something underlying all of this? Is there a purposefulness in all of this conflict, disagreement, and beautiful contrasts and differences? And maybe that underlying oneness, I wonder if you see anything, notice anything like this. But war and peace, poverty and wealth, consciousness and unconsciousness, all of these things are potentially collaborating to reveal something about the fundamental nature of reality, which is love. Even though the word doesn't do the reality justice, right? That people go to war for stupid reasons because they're mind controlled and they're mere, instruments of proxies, etc. And yet in those circumstances, they experience love for their brothers or sisters. Love keeps revealing itself in sin and virtue. Sometimes our weaknesses benefit us more than our virtues. So underlying the differences, the diversities, and along with some kind of movement that may be happening in humanity as a whole, in humanity's consciousness, is there an underlying unity, oneness, as long as we don't mistake it for sameness.
Beautiful.
Well, you really sparked something in there. I remember having a conversation with Thomas. It wasn't about all-inclusiveness yet, but I was going on about the liturgy being dualistic, how we're back and forth with God the whole time. And I was moving towards all conceptualized, really, but I was moving towards God as the only self. And he was like, oh, cool. And then I talked about, God is beyond everything. Oh, yes, yes. And I didn't know, I was excluding certain things, right? And he said, God is so utterly generous. God will come to you in every way. The other, perfect. The self, perfect. The great beyond, the as it isness, perfect. And so there was a all-inclusive or underlying sense of oneness that was not a thing in itself, like you were kind of talking about, Ed. Whereas if the oneness becomes distinct, well then it's no good again. So that is all.
It's beautiful, beautiful.
Perhaps Swami would say, nitty, nutty, nitty.
Nitty, nitty, yeah.
Not this, not that. This is a way of...
I'm remembering a story that Rami shared with some of us about visiting Thomas maybe 2 or 3 years ago on one of the many occasions on which he was dying. And Rami asked him, well, what Thomas thought would happen, to his self when he died. And he said that he kind of looked at him like, oh, Rami, like, you're still asking that question. But he said that Thomas said, he took both of his hands and he lifted them and said, Thomas comes up, and I let Thomas go. And then Thomas comes up, and I let Thomas go. And one day Thomas will stop coming up. But it struck me that, it's that constructed self. Thomas is always teaching about our false self systems. That whole constructed self that comes up, and you let it go. And that when you let it go, what's left is what's real. But the whole question about Christian, post-Christian, like some of you were saying, both things seem to be happening at the same time. I experienced him in many ways as becoming very post-Christian in the last few years. His language often would be just extremely universal, and he would say things that didn't have specific Christian reference points. I remember him talking about the baggage, the cultural or mythological baggage in our traditions and things, and that falling away or that getting in the way. And him saying a lot, things like, each of us is, you are God wanting to be you, and that, but that was how he was talking about incarnation in this very big sense. God having a human experience in each of us, a created experience in everything. And so the language was increasingly, again, is it post-Christian or is it maybe it's trans-Christian? He came through it into this wide field of seeing, but he could still use language of Trinity. But it was, like you said, Swami, no walls with the language anymore. And that increasingly he was just, an embodied heart. That he was a heart that was so physically embodied, like Bree said. He was just, in every cell, he was heartfulness. And I do feel like he can be attuned to still. And I don't know what I mean by that, is he out there, whatever. But that the essence of him, that he was a name of God that had flowered, that had ripened, and the essence of Thomas, the qualities of Thomas are still alive in our hearts and the heart of the universe and the heart of God, and that you can just in a second, in a moment, you can just tune into his frequency. You can just go, oh, there you are. And he's just alive with fullness in your heart, in your own embodiedness. There's that embodied heart of Thomas.
Terrific.
That sparked something for me, Matthew, which was that, in so many ways, was he Christian, more Christian at the end? In some ways, and I just said this, it just came out, maybe, Christianity is actually just beginning to recognize its incarnational principle. And we've spent more time in Platonic ideas than we have in Christian ideas, or in, ideas modeled after Jesus. And so maybe that was part of his parting gift, was to fully incarnate in the incarnational aspects of our faith, which are more geared toward the generosity of love, of true union that differentiates, which is what love does. So I think this is sounding more incarnational, more of a descent into unity as opposed to a ascent.
Oh, one more sentence. So on oneness, at that Snowmass dialogue, he had little audiences with groups of 5 of us or something, and I asked him, well, why did you want us all to get together? What was the point of getting all these different, Richard Rohr folks and Thomas Keating folks and Tilden Edwards folks, getting everyone together? And he said, I just wanted you to get to know each other. And it strikes me that that's one sense of what oneness was for Thomas, that oneness unfolds in our coming to know each other, which is also a verse in the Quran, that I could have made you into one community if I'd wanted to, but I made you into different groups, different people, so that you might come to intimately know each other. And so that oneness is unfolding through our getting to know and getting to love each other.
Okay, Will.
Just a short little piece. I had a number of conversations with Thomas around essentially the transcendent oneness that's universal across the religions, partly probably because that was part of the theme of the book I was working on. So, but I remember a conversation about a saying from Meister Eckhart, where Meister Eckhart says, I have the essence of it right, but I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he says the 3 persons of the Trinity are as far below the Godhead as the earth is below heaven. And so we were talking about how the traditions meet in the Godhead, in the Absolute, and that at the level of the Trinity, the other religions have other structures of divinity. And he was very, at least in conversations with me, very strong on the absolute importance of the universal absolute. And I know that, I remember, and I'm sure many of you have worked with him more than I have, but he wrote the foreword to my book, and it was 14 drafts before it got to where he was happy with it. And part of the reason was that some of his early drafts were too unchristian. And he was getting critical feedback from some of his colleagues and saying, you can't say that. It'd be interesting to look at the evolution of those 14 drafts
It would.
to see what he did from the first one to the last one.
Do you have those, Will?
I could probably dig them up.
That might be a very interesting
It could be
archival
interesting.
piece to not lose track of.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
But the essence of it was that, as he said once, he said, and he said it so beautifully, you know, it's not enough to simply sit there and listen patiently to the religious views of another and respect them. We have to love the other religions. We have to love the other religions. And then he said, and by that I mean, we have to practice and engage them deeply enough to the point where we experience ultimate reality. That was the term he used. He liked to call it ultimate mystery until the Buddhists told him that it wasn't a mystery to them. Some of you probably know about this. But anyway, until we experience ultimate reality in that other religion, that same ultimate reality that I am so moved and inspired by in my religion, we experience it in the other religion, and in that way, there is this profound bridge. So I know that he felt that that bridging in the transcendent sort of Brahma Nirguna was absolutely essential to the true interspiritual project.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Eric's got it next, and then,
Just wanted, when he said ultimate reality in many things, was he assuming that they're the same, or there's a diversity in ultimate reality among the different traditions? And that's okay.
I'm just guessing here that he meant that they were more the same than different. It's kind of the first principle of their 8 points of agreement, that the world religions bear witness to a supreme reality that they call the ultimate reality. In that first principle, I think they're suggesting that there's a shared universal there across all the traditions.
yeah. Okay.
Yes, I totally shifted where I was going, but there's a quality of going to Bhutan and bringing something. You know, in my mind it was receiving, but really there's something that's unique to Christianity, and it's the love factor that was brought by our group to Bhutan. That texture, that flavor wasn't present with the monks. So I think there's a uniqueness that's shared. Also, Thomas, at the end, he was speaking up until right when he was leaving Snowmass, and then up until about 5 weeks before his death. A lot of his talks, or a lot of his teachings, were straight parables and like back to the basics, very much theological. So he was really returning, which he hadn't spoken like that to me in the previous years as much. So he was really returning to that. And in regards to oneness, there's a simple knowing what to do-ness in the moment that Thomas really showed, a real utter simplicity, a poverty that knew what to say and what to do in the moment. And that's really tied in with the poverty of not taking hold of anything. Thomas was able to be in your interiors and knowing what your interiors needed, or what the field needed. And it was just an utter, again, simplicity that allowed him to speak what needed to be.
Thank you. So just to pick up on something Will said, at one of the last Snowmass conferences that Father Thomas was present for, he was giving a kind of a closing, and you might remember this, Rory. He talked about the divine mystery playing a great game of hide and seek with us. playing it so well that the Buddhists still haven't found him, and it was just this beautiful. Faithful remark. But one thing he said to me, and it really stuck with me as a beautiful formulation of the Christian path, was this dream that I mentioned to the two of you, to a monk of Snowmass, an anonymous monk of Snowmass. The Father B. Griffiths came to a monk of Snowmass and said three things. There is an other. Become the other. There is no other. And he said, Father B. had instructed that that's the path of transformation. And those words always stuck with me. And so he wrote about it a little bit in, the other being the divine, becoming the other as in the imitation of Christ, and then realizing there is no other. But I realized those 3 points in the path mean they can be taken so many ways. For instance, this is what Father Thomas was doing with all of us. There is an other. Become the other. He became us all the time to demonstrate that there is no other. So those, to me, have really been a beautiful distillation of the Christian path and absolute words to live by.
Yeah. A little bit of a filling in of the details of that, and then I'll put it over to Kurt, that the anonymous monk in question there at Snowmass was my dear buddy, Michael Boudreau. And it was actually Michael who received it from Bede, and Thomas picked it up from Michael and passed it on and took it to Beautiful Things. I was there with them right at the time when that communication was being communicated. That was back in the mid-90s, and it became pivotal for both of them. So, Kurt was, oh yeah, right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Regarding the issue of suffering,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Thomas's suffering,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the last years of his life, I do think he was at one with God. I think that was his oneness was really the source of all of his work. He talked about the transforming union, and I was very alert in the early days to listen to how he was talking about how he was speaking about the transforming union, and he never claimed it for himself. And that perked my interest. Someone asked him once in a conference, one of the retreatants, well, you're talking about the transforming union and oneness. Are you there? And he did everything he could to deflect answering her directly. And I asked him later, I said, she asked you, are you there? And he said, well, she thinks I am. What he was curious was about, most curious about, I felt, was something beyond oneness, like unity. And that's where I think he was in his own evolution, which he was most curious about the Buddhist teachings on no self, because in Christian mysticism there's less description of that state of consciousness. But I appreciated that he talked about it as no fixed point of reference for the self. Mm-hmm. Much like what I think you've said, Cynthia, the flowering of true personhood is when there's no fixed point of reference for the self in Christian terms. Mm-hmm. And he told me once that he thought at one time, after all the suffering and pain at St. Joseph's monastery when he was abbot, he was discerning what to do, and he thought about not being a monk anymore. But he decided to remain a monk because he felt that was the way he could help most people. So I think that's maybe true about his relationship to Christianity too. He didn't necessarily need to wear Christianity for himself, but that's the way he could help most people. And by remaining a monk, remaining a Christian, he was fully a monk and fully a Christian. In other words, it wasn't just a costume. It was part of his manifestation, his presence in this human life. And his humanity was fully flourishing in those ways. But like, Mother Teresa of Calcutta in her letters and descriptions of her own interior state, which included a lot of suffering, inner suffering over the years, I think Thomas's suffering was fully his own in his human personhood, but it was also suffering that he was carrying for those around him. And especially the work he was doing, which is what Mother Teresa, I think, was doing. Her suffering was bearing the suffering of her ministry in the world, like Christ. So, and he told me once when I was very sick and unable to do the kind of work I had been doing, some retreat work and stuff, he said, well, see if you can get better enough to do a little bit of the work. It might make you feel better. In other words, to be engaged and to be in the active world, which was no longer separate from contemplation, but an expression of unity with everyone else.
But so you're talking basically about a bodhisattva archetype there. Yep. Yep.
Just to pick up a little bit on what you were saying, David, about him suffering for others. During the time that I spent with him in the last month of his life, he suffered physically a lot. And one of the things that is indelibly etched in my memory is sitting at the foot of his bed and looking at him and eyes closed, clearly responding to some kind of internal stimuli and moaning and grimacing and clearly in a lot of pain, and looking at him, and right above his bed was a crucifix. And it was just undeniable for me that everything that he was feeling and suffering, he was going through for all of us.
Wow. Wow. I think with that revelation, we've reached the closing point of this circle. That's extraordinary, what's come forward. Let's take a break. Heather, do you want to give any instructions about what awaits us back there?
Take coffee and food, help yourself, and it's all ready. And what time do we want to be back?
Let's take 20, okay? I think we still have time, so about 5 after 10, will that work for people to just take a break, go outside if you can and breathe some air, and we'll be back. Whew, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow, yeah. Knocks your socks off.